recording this for the future because I hope that we have another opportunity to talk about Celtic Christianity. It's good to have a friend and colleague with us. Rod Newman is the pastor currently at Norman Bridgeview United Methodist Church. It's halfway between Norman and halfway between Moore. So, and those two towns are growing so close together, literally across the street from Moore. I've known Rod a long time. We've served on the board of ministry together. He's been in some capacity at Oklahoma City University or Paul School of Theology since 2007. Holds a degree from Tulsa University and then also from Princeton, where he did his Master of Divinity. One of the things I've appreciated about Rod over the years is, well, there's a lot of things, but one is his humor. Secondly, is his willingness to take college students to Ireland for about days. Anyone willing to hang out with college students in a foreign country that long must be a great guy. And so knowing that his affinity for Celtic Christianity, knowing that St. Patrick's Day is just right around the corner, we thought this would be a great opportunity to have Rod with us and talk to us about Celtic Christianity. And so we pray God's blessings upon our time together, and that wherever we are, whether on Zoom, Facebook, at the comfort of our homes, or in our offices, wherever they may be, that we find the comfort and care of the God who creates us. And so, Rod, we turn it over to you, and I look forward to your time with us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, the opportunity to be with you. I call St. Patrick's Day my high holy day, and this is my season, even though it comes in the middle of Lent. Excuse me. So, yes, I'm always ready to talk about Celtic Christianity. I've taught a course here at OCU several times. Had 3 trips to Ireland with the students that study abroad, and so it's obviously a passion of mine. I will say that how I first got first got interested in it was in about the year 2000. I was going through a rather low point in my own faith, and I ran across Ian Bradley's book called The Celtic Way. I read it at the time I needed to read it in my life, and it opened up a whole new world to me, a world that of an expression of Christianity that had been around for centuries. I just wasn't aware of it. And it fed my soul in such a way that I couldn't get enough. And I've kept learning and studying, and these trips are partly to connect with that. And so I'm happy to share that with you today. So let's see if I can share my screen, or not if I can, but if I can make it work. All right, there it is. And can you see my screen? I want to assume yes.
Yes,
okay, thank you.
Yes.
All right, now let me go, see if I can go to full screen. I'm not seeing how to do that, but you can see enough. All right, let me go over here. All right, now here we go. That's what I'm looking for. All right, so here's what I'd like to do today in terms of covering it. We're going to do an overview of Celtic Christianity. We'll cover a lot of different areas, and partly because one of the beauties of Celtic Christianity is that it integrates art, religion, legends, history, all kinds of things. And that's one reason I'm so attracted to it. So first of all, we're going to look at who are the Celts. And then we'll look at how Christianity came to Ireland. And I'm focusing primarily on Ireland because that's what I've studied most. A lot of what I'm saying today will also apply to Scotland, Wales, parts of Normandy, parts of Spain, but I'm going to focus primarily in Ireland. We're going to look at the monasteries and their importance and how they were different from the continent. We'll look at the art saints and some legends around them, and then some of the theology. And then finally, we'll be talking about some modern influences and how Celtic Christianity is still finding new expressions today. So let's start with who are the Celts. Scholars, as most things, disagree on who the Celts are, but the best that I can tell from from what I've read, and the consensus seems to be that the Celtic people, the earliest archaeological evidence, if you want to look at their particular style of art, would have been in the Switzerland area and went out from there. The Celts were not a racial group. They were a group of people that were bound together by language, custom, practices such as that. And they, instead of being a distinctly racial group. You can see here, though, that they covered a lot of Central Europe eventually. The old name for France is Gaul, which is an expression of Gallic or Gaelic, means Celt. Then you see there's a pocket down here in the Spanish Iberian Peninsula. There's also a pocket over here in the middle of Turkey in the region called Galatia, which again, you can hear the Gaul, the land of the Celts, in there. And as you know, Paul wrote one of his letters to the church in Galatians, who I guess you could claim to be some of the first Celtic Christians, although not necessarily the kind we'll be talking about today. And then most famously, when we think of Celts, we think of the far western reaches in England, Scotland, Wales, and in Ireland. So once they got to Ireland, there was really no other place to go. And so they tended to congregate there. So speaking of Ireland, this is a topographical map of Ireland. And I mention this because the land does make a difference in how things developed. Ireland, if you want to think of it this way, is kind of like a bowl. You have the highlands on the outer rim. They call them mountains, but that's much like the mountains in southwestern Oklahoma. They're not huge mountains like we might think of that. They are higher places in the land. And so that's on the coast. And then in the middle, you have a lot of bogland that over centuries created peat, the compression of all that moist, swampy land. And then they burned it, that still and burning it for forever, for house fires and other things as well. Now I mention this partly also because travel in ancient Ireland was much safer by water than by land. If you traveled by water, it was a pretty much open concourse. The River Shannon runs up here through here, the River Liffey over here by Dublin. If you try to go over land, if you went up in the highlands, part of the problem is you might run into bandits, you might run into wild animals, and of course, roads almost non-existent. If you tried to go through the boglands, you very well could get a wheel caught in one of the bogs or a foot caught in one of the bogs, and it made it very difficult to travel. And that's one reason why we see things develop the way they do. All right, so a little historical background. When I talk about Celtic Christianity, I'm limiting it to Christianity as it developed in these lands from the 5th to the 11th centuries. After the 11th, 12th century was the coming of the English or the Normans, and that changed things dramatically. The 5th century is when St. Patrick came back to Ireland, and I'll mention him in just a moment. The other thing that makes them distinct is Ireland was never conquered by Rome. So Christianity did not come to Ireland at the point of a sword. It came to Ireland through more peaceful means, as we will discuss in a moment. Also, Ireland was a completely rural island. until the 800s. And the first cities in Ireland were actually Viking cities on the coast. And then lastly, it incorporated the pre-Christian culture. Christianity developed differently there because it took into account the existing Celtic traditions and lore expectations and melded it into Christianity in a unique way. And what I don't have on here is another thing that I think is very important to know, and that is, even though Ireland is as far west as you can be on the European continent, what came together there was a mixture of Western Christianity coming out of Rome and Eastern Christianity coming out of Constantinople and the Egyptian desert. Western Christianity tends, very oversimplified, tends to be more rational. Eastern Christianity tends to be more mystical. And so for those two to come together in one spot like that created some really interesting expressions of Christianity. I'm not so concerned that you know the details of this chart. I just want to show you the range we're looking at. In the year 410, Rome abandoned Britain. They started pulling their soldiers back from the frontier, not just in Britain, to deal with the threat to Rome itself. And the famous saying was, look to your own defenses. So when they left that region in the year 410, that opened up a lot of space for people, for a lot of pent up anger. Some of the clans who were fighting that weren't able to when Rome was there, some of the sea lanes, all that opened up. Also, it opened up in a time which made it very confusing and very volatile. It was in that time when St. Patrick actually was in his ministry in Ireland at a very crucial time. St. Bridget I'll mention her in just a moment. She was almost a contemporary of Patrick. And then about 100 years later, we have Columba. And the year 563 is important in the sense that when there was an explosion of monastic monastery building in the late 6th century. Some might even say the Golden Age. The Vikings first made their raid in the year 793, and they began to raid periodically, usually in good weather. After that, usually on the coast. Then they started getting bolder and they started setting up cities and started intermingling with the Irish. But they were an incredibly important historical event. And the Book of Kells we'll look at when we look at the art. If you've been to Dublin, hopefully you've been able to see the Book of Kells as an illuminated manuscript, the height of that artwork in Celtic Christianity. I might just say while we're doing this, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat window, or you can hold it and I'll take a moment to take questions about halfway through, and then at the end, we'll take some more. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the first Christians in Ireland. As I said, it didn't come through the Roman army. So the first Christians were almost certainly traders, merchants, who set up expatriate communities on the island. Also, the first Christians were slaves. There was a very vigorous slave trade, and some from Africa, but some from other parts of Europe. And the slaves that came or brought to Ireland were, some of them were Christian. And so the Pope, learning about this group of Christians there, even though it was not the indigenous people, was concerned about their pastoral needs. And so in the year 431, he sent a man named Palladius to be the first bishop of Ireland. He was tasked with two things. One was to take care of the pastoral needs of the Christians who were already there. And then secondly, to be an evangelist, to look after the faithful and to make the barbarian island Christian. as was in his charge. So it's a fair question to ask, if you have a rural island that is not Christian, how do you bring a faith that is primarily urban up to this point into a completely rural setting with people who already have well-established religious ideas and practices? And one of the principal ways they did that was through a series of monasteries. The first thing that I like to stress when we talk about monasteries in the Celtic world, they were not what you normally think of when you think of a monastery such as in Western Europe. These were not necessarily cloistered. They were not necessarily made up of people who were all celibate. Indeed, there were some monasteries that had married members of that community, children running around the monastery, men and women in some of them. It was not just the people who were religious, so to speak, or professionally religious, but it also included the farmers, those who had animals, metal workers, all those people that were in the vicinity were considered part of the monastic community. Since there were no cities, these became some of the primary gathering places for people. And eventually there might be some markets that would pop up around them. They also were places where some of the more wealthy would store some of their wealth because they figured that was the safest place. Also, they were used to some degree to take ne'er-do-wells who they couldn't control in the local communities. I mean, there are no prisons. So one thing they might do is send them to a monastery for the monks to look after them and for them to be integrated into a more positive, regimented part of society. Another thing that's important is that they drew from different clans. The Celts were very clannish. Their first commitment was to the clan. There was no sense of a nation of Ireland or Scotland. These were different clans that gathered around. There was a loose confederations in terms of the geographic areas. There was what they would call a high king of Ireland, but it wasn't like somebody sitting in a palace somewhere issuing edicts. It was more somebody that was a first among equals and just kind of helped maintain peace over the island. The clans would have leaders within the clans. They were not necessarily hereditary offices that were passed down from one place to another, one person to another. And they were not necessarily considered autocrats. They lived in the community. They were more like a mayor, I suppose, in our way of thinking about things. But my point is that they tended to stay within their clan. The monasteries were one of, if not the main place, where people from different clans would come together to form a new unit outside of that. They were in diverse geographical locations. In other words, some were built by rivers, some were built in mountains, some on the plains. It was just wherever people were. They also were a place to train clergy and scholars. And then very famously, and if you've read How the Irish Saved Civilization, very famously, they had scriptoriums, they called them, where they copied manuscripts, principally religious manuscripts, but not exclusively. This is an artist rendition of what a monastery may have looked like. One of the things that you'll notice right off are these interesting looking buildings. This more than likely is representative of what the homes of the Celts would have looked like. They're usually built round, out of mud and wattle, they called it, with sticks with mud in between. Then there would be a grass or thatched roof on top of that. There would be a fire in the middle, and the smoke would rise up through the through the thatch and escaped that way. And then these then became places for the monasteries too, because that's the way they lived. You also see what I mentioned earlier. You see the plants and the animals that were out here in order to support the monastery. This particular one is by a river, and they would have access to fresh water and also to transportation. If eventually there would be pilgrims that would like to come to these particular monasteries, and that would give them a route to be able to get there. You also notice the cross here, these high standing crosses, which we'll look at more in a moment. These crosses often marked out boundaries within the monastery. They also could be seen as a place for outdoor worship gathering places, but they served as a centerpiece or as a center focusing object within the monastic grounds. Here's pictures of a couple of monasteries. The first of all is Glendalough. Glendalough means glen between the lakes. There are two beautiful lakes up in these hills. This, by the way, is just south of Dublin in the Wicklow Mountains. If you go to Ireland, you need to go to Glendalough. It is a beautiful, beautiful place, not to mention the monastic ruins that are there. This is an example down here of, you can see the ruins peeking through. The ruins that you find in the monasteries in Ireland would have been from later, like the 10th or 11th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. The original monasteries, of course, were made of mud and wattle. Well, that means they're gone. They weren't permanent structures. These are later ones that were built on the same site. I might also mention while we're here, this tower, which you see all over the Irish landscape, at least the ruins of them. This one has been worked on, reconstructed enough to give you a sense of what it looked like. For a long time, scholars were confused, or people were confused about what these were used for. Some said they were used to escape the Vikings, which I think is a little funny. If Vikings are coming over the hill, I think the last place you'd want to be is these. I mean, you'd be a goner for sure. What these were actually prayer towers. So that means since they prayed 8 times a day, some poor soul would have to climb a ladder to that hole and then climb up inside of this to the top. They would hold a bell and hit it with a hammer, and they'd hit it with a hammer, and then they would send the signal out so that everyone in the surrounding areas could hear that it was time to pray. They went up as high as they could, so the sound would travel as far as it could, and more people could be aware of it. Okay, and then here's Clonmacnoise. Clonmacnoise is right almost dead center in the island of Ireland. It is known and became very influential primarily because it was on the intersection of the River Shannon and what's called an esker. An esker is a gravel deposit left when the glaciers receded. Since the boglands were so dangerous, there would be these eskers, fortunately, that ran not continuously, but pretty much across the center of Ireland, and they would travel on top of those eskers. So in essence, what you have here is right at the intersection of 2 major highways. They built their monastic community there, and as I said, became very influential. Okay, I want to say a word about the Celtic saints, and this will, I could tell stories all day about these Celtic saints. And by the way, I don't know, I'm seeing a note here that says there's only like 8 minutes left on the meeting time. I don't know what that's about, but I just want to let you know I'm seeing that.
I just saw that as well, so I'm
Okay.
panicking and trying to figure out how to extend the time. So
all right, I am going to keep
talking and I'll figure it out.
I'm going to keep talking until I get cut off, which hopefully won't be. So let's talk about the Celtic saints just a minute. when we talk about saints now, we often think about people that are officially canonized by the Roman Church. Well, in the early days, they didn't have a canonization process. These were just people that the locals revered, honored, saw them as models, and wanted to keep their stories in front of them. And so I want to mention two in particular. And the first one I want to mention is St. Patrick, since his day is coming up. Patrick was born and raised on the west, more than likely on the west coast of modern day England, probably a Romanized Celt. His father and grandfather were officials in the church and in the community. When he was 16 years old, there were a group of Irish bandits that came up to his home and snatched him from his bed in the middle of the night, took him to Ireland to become a slave. If you go to Ireland today, especially in the north, you'll find many places claiming that St. Patrick was there. It's kind of like George Washington slept here. But nevertheless, he was somewhere in the north and was put to tending sheep. And we know this because we have two documents from his hand. One of them is his, in essence, autobiography. And he tells a story of being enslaved for 6 years. He was not necessarily a person of faith when he was taken there, but he became one as he sat in his isolation and loneliness, tending these sheep, recalling what he could of the faith that he had been taught. And he renewed his faith. He actually chose then to try to escape, which was unheard of in those days. I told you about how dangerous it was to travel, and especially if you were alone. But somehow he made it to the south coast, which is where the ships going back to England docked. He got on one of those ships to be the, in essence, I'll work for you if you take me home. And so they agreed. And when he got home, he decided to go to study for the priesthood. And then he had a vision, he claims, of a Irishman saying, "Come back and help us," much like Paul in the Macedonian vision. So he announced that he was going to go back to Ireland, and all of his colleagues thought he was crazy because Ireland was the ends of the earth. There was a lot of anti-Celt, anti-Irish sentiment even then. They were considered not worthy of the gospel. His family, of course, freaked out because it's like, now we got you home, you're going to go back. And it's not even clear. It could be that Patrick didn't even really like the Irish that much. And you can see why if they'd kidnapped you. But he said, "I'm going, I'm called and I'm going." And he went back to Ireland and he began his ministry, baptizing, preaching, evangelizing, and became a instrumental figure in the history of Christianity in Ireland. Now, the stories about the snakes and all that came much later, and they're not necessarily that interesting compared to the real story. I think one of the main things to know about Patrick is here is an example of a person who was mistreated by these people, and yet, against the advice of his fellows, said, yes, these people are worthy of the gospel, and they're worthy enough for me to give my life in order to bring it to them. And so, in an incredible act of forgiveness, he went back to Ireland and evangelized. The second person I want to mention is St. Bridget. It's not necessarily shocking that a woman would be one of the leading Celtic saints. In pre-Christian Celtic culture, women had more rights than other societies of the time. Women was not unheard of to be leaders, not common, but not unheard of. And so Bridget made she founded a monastery and was the abbess along with a man who served with her. And it was a male and female within the monastery in Kildare, which is just south and west of Dublin. I could tell Bridget's stories all day, but let me just say one that is often very a favorite. And that is that there's a story of a man, a poor man who was hunting, and he just happened to wander into the king's forest and shot a fox and found out that it was the king's favorite fox, and it was trained actually to do tricks for his guests whenever they would come. So not only did he lose his fox, he also lost his entertainment. And so when the king heard about this, he called for the man to be brought in and set the date for his execution. Well, Bridget heard about this, so she jumps in her chariot and she starts towards the king's palace or king's house. On the way, while she's going through the forest, another fox jumps into her chariot and she gives it a ride with her back to the king. And so she walks in and she says, I plead for mercy for this man. And the king said, too late. I've already made up my mind. And she said, well, what if I could give you another fox that could do the same tricks as the fox that was killed? And he said, okay. So she opens her cloak and out comes this little fox. The king gives the orders. The fox does all the tricks. And so the king releases the man. Bridget gets in her chariot and goes back home. And a few days later, the little fox runs back into the forest. Now, it's one thing, it shows Bridget's generosity. It shows her sense of justice. And this is one of many stories of the Celtic saints that involve animals, which is a way of expressing their interest and their connection to the natural world. Okay. So, Greg, should I pause here just a minute?
Yeah, I've got one of our technicians working on it
Okay.
at his house, so I'm hoping afraid to. Okay. I don't know why we only set it for. Shoot. So if we lose this, I've got, like I said, I've got a technician working on it. I've asked any word and he's not said anything. If we lose this, I will set up another Zoom meeting like within a minute and send it
Okay.
to you, Rod, and then we'll go back to live streaming.
All right. We're good.
So let's just.
I'm nothing but if not flexible.